Thank you very much for the invitation, first of all. It is a little bit of a trip down memory lane for me, in the sense that I spent the second half of my 15-year exile in Britain. And to interact with the comrades from the British section is always a privilege for me. But yeah, it's not a time for reminiscing. The comrades, I think, have obviously indicated that the enormous movement of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US throughout the world has brought back memories of the struggle against apartheid and given us the opportunity to reflect on the lessons of that struggle in order to learn from it for the purposes of taking forward the struggle that is taking place today. It is the position of the ANC leadership that the downfall of apartheid was brought about by 4 pillars of struggle, I think they call it. The first was the diplomatic isolation of the country through the United Nations and other international institutions, which went with economic sanctions and the arms embargo. The second was the sports and cultural boycott. The third was the armed struggle against the apartheid regime by the ANC's military wing called Umkhonto weSizwe, Spear of the Nation. And last, the struggle of the masses inside the country. Now, I think it is very significant, even the order in which the so-called 4 pillars are listed in the ANC's version of events as far as the liberation struggle is concerned and the defeat of the apartheid regime. I think that the first thing that needs to be pointed out, though, is that, of course, it would be completely wrong to discount, particularly the propaganda effect that the arms embargo and economic sanctions had on South Africa. But it would be criminal to not point out that the manner in which the arms embargo, as well as the economic sanctions campaign was conducted, was soaked in hypocrisy on the part of imperialism. Because sanctions busting was developed into an art form, rendering the economic sanctions against the regime completely meaningless. The same thing applied to the arms embargo. In fact, it didn't prevent the South African regime from importing arms to the point where it even had nuclear cooperation with the State of Israel. But the effect that it had was to stimulate the development of the South Africa's own armaments industry and the establishment of what came to be called the Arms Corporation of South Africa, which received enormous technological and other support, expertise from the capitalist class internationally. So far as the cultural, sports, boycott, and so forth is concerned, it would also be incorrect to say that it didn't have a certain impact, particularly in the struggle against apartheid, which enjoyed tremendous support internationally at that particular point in time, sparking enormous demonstrations by workers and youth throughout the world, and at least as far as disrupting attempts to circumvent the sports boycott is concerned, the disrupting of matches involving the apartheid regime's rugby team and so on and so forth, it gave the youth abroad something to do more than just to participate in a demonstration. So it had a certain propaganda value as well. And the same thing, but then I think, again, the component of the boycott of South Africa that had the biggest impact, it must be recognized, is the action by organized workers in the trade union. We had relations, for example, with workers at Heathrow Airport, in which, by the way, the militant, as it was then known, our British section, was able to utilize its influence in the labor movement, put us in touch with workers who were able to provide us with means to smuggle literature onto the aircraft flying to South Africa from Heathrow Airport. We were able to have links with workers, members of militant, who were members of the Transport and General Workers Union, who also played a similar role, not only enabling us to smuggle literature into the country, but also to raise the question of boycotting the handling of South African goods. One of the most famous such campaigns was that by the workers in Ireland at Dunn stores, who boycotted the handling of South African produce and who were sacked for that, but who remained on the picket line for more than a year until eventually the Irish government became the first government in Western Europe actually to adopt a policy on the question of trade sanctions in South Africa officially. And that, I think, was much more significant than all the others put together. As far as the arms struggle is concerned, again, one can't discount the impact that it had on raising, to some degree, the confidence of the masses inside South Africa, that at least some effort is being made to confront this regime militarily. And the occasional fireworks, such as the explosions at Sasol and other strategic economic targets, of course, enjoy the support of the masses inside South Africa. But it would be a gross exaggeration to argue that the regime was forced onto its knees by the armed struggle, however heroic the combatants of Mkhonto we Sizwe may have been. Because the armed struggle was no more, in the eyes of the leadership, as a propaganda exercise for the purposes of compelling the regime to come to the negotiating table. In any event, it is one of the issues that separated us as the Marxist Workers Tendency of the ANC at that time from the leadership of the ANC and the SACP, so far as the strategy to fight white minority rule in South Africa is concerned. Because what we pointed out is that whilst it would be completely utopian to think that the working class in South Africa would not need arms in order to confront the regime, it would be a mistake to simply rip out of experiences of other countries like Vietnam or even Zimbabwe or Mozambique, where guerrilla struggles were taking place, and to graft that tactic onto conditions that were completely different as far as South Africa is concerned. South Africa is an industrialized country. The advent of colonialism, developed later into apartheid, involved the complete dispossession of the indigenous population and the complete destruction of the economy on which the indigenous population rested at the time, and the conversion of the entire population either into an active labor force, first for the mining industry and later for industry in manufacturing and other secondary aspects of the economy that developed on the back of the mining industry. And it was arranged in such a manner that in order to benefit from a plentiful supply of cheap labor, the population in the rural areas had to be placed in a position where they were completely and utterly dependent on the money economy that colonialism had brought with it as part of the capitalist reconstruction of South African society at that time. And therefore, there was no possibility of the development of a rural population such as you may have had in China, Vietnam, or indeed Zimbabwe, where that could provide support for a guerrilla force to combat the apartheid regime. The main force for the struggle against apartheid, as a result of the manner in which colonialism and capitalism developed in South Africa from the very beginning, was the working class itself. And therefore, that method of struggle was inappropriate to the extent that arms had a role to play. The position that we took as the Marxist Workers Tendency at the time is that MK should provide training to workers and youth inside the townships for the purposes of setting up self-defense units to combat the armed forces of the state. But that would be supplementary to the main struggle that must spearhead the struggle, the battle against white minority rule, apartheid, and capitalism in South Africa. And that's the organization of the working class itself. If you listen to the words of the recently republished biography of one of the more well-known MK combatants, Robert McBride, he makes it abundantly clear in his autobiography that the leadership had made it clear to the combatants themselves that the purpose of the armed struggle was not to overthrow apartheid, but to merely persuade it to come to the table for a negotiated settlement. And that was consistent with the aims with which the ANC was established, in fact, from the beginning in 1912. The ANC at that time represented a black elite, shopkeepers, landowners before the Land Act of 1913 was introduced, prohibiting the ownership of land by African people, lawyers, doctors, and so forth, whose objection to colonialism and apartheid later wasn't to the capitalist economic order that it had brought with it into the country, but the fact that they were not afforded the opportunity to be absorbed into the political and economic arrangement that existed following the conquest of the country by colonialism at that time. In other words, the ANC represented from the very beginning an aspirant capitalist class. And if the leadership had this attitude towards the working class, as I've described at the beginning of my remarks, it is rooted in the class character of the ANC leadership itself, that they always ever wanted, despite the evolution of the ANC to the point where it adopted even the armed struggle as a tactic, as well as mobilized the masses in what was called the Congress of the People in 1955, out of which came the adoption of the Freedom Charter, with clauses calling for the nationalization of the banks, the mines, and the factories. Throughout that period, the ANC was always committed to the preservation of capitalism, and their tactics and strategies reflected that reality. And that is the reason that they approached the armed struggle in the manner that they did, but it explained the hostility to the position that we were putting forward as a Marxist Workers Tendency of the ANC, to call for the strengthening of the independent trade unions that the working class were beginning to build in South Africa, for the forging of links between them and the working class internationally, and to put an emphasis on the linkages between apartheid and capitalism. The explanation that we gave, that the apartheid system may have been given its apartheid, its Afrikaans name when the Nats took power, the Nationalist Party took power in 1948. But in reality, the architecture, the administrative, political, and state architecture for the apartheid system was put in place by British capitalism, as a matter of fact, because it consisted of the migrant labor system, of the labor reservoirs into which people were herded following dispossession of their land, the introduction of influx control laws to control the influx of people from the labor reservoirs into the cities, according to the needs of the capitalist class and of the white population in the cities. That is what formed the material foundation for the system of what was later called apartheid. All that the Afrikaners did upon coming to power in 1948 was to translate the language of oppression and exploitation of the working class into Afrikaans. But separate development was in reality the foundations for that laid by British imperialism and the policies that they had pursued. And I'm pointing all of this out because I think that is what enables us to understand the manner in which the consciousness of the working class in South Africa developed in the period following the beginning rather with the 1973 strikes that took place in Durban. And those strikes were historically significant for this reason, that they put an end to a period of quiescence in the struggle against apartheid and white minority rule in South Africa that had been in place since 1960, when the ANC was banned after the apartheid regime had imposed a state of emergency, banned alongside the PAC, driving the South African Congress of Trade Unions underground, as well as the renamed South African Communist Party. And for a whole period, the working class had its head down. The apartheid regime strengthened its repressive power, sent the leadership into jail. Mandela in 1964 was sentenced to life imprisonment and so forth. But in the period following the end of the Second World War, world capitalism began to undergo a boom that began particularly around 1950. And that boom had an enormous impact also on the economic development of South Africa itself. And in that sense, South Africa is a classical example of what Marx pointed out when he explained that the capitalist class creates its own grave diggers in the form of the working class. Because the very development of the South African economy with relatively high growth rates throughout that whole period, from the mid-1950s, 1960 onwards, created a working class that was beginning to feel confident in its own strength. And the first strikes that took place in Durban, in what is now known as KwaZulu-Natal, signified the entry of the working class into the struggle. That in turn inspired the youth, who had in turn been inspired by the civil rights movement, which gave rise in South Africa to the Black Consciousness movement led by Steve Biko, culminating in the Soweto uprising of 1976. And these two movements of the working class on the one hand and the youth on the other inevitably resulted in the gravitation of both forces towards each other. And by 1984 to 1986, the fusing of these two movements gave rise to an insurrectionary challenge to the regime, aided politically also by the establishment of a political organization that acted as a front from the ANC when it was established in 1983, known as the United Democratic Front. The regime was pushed onto the retreat by these developments. It attempted to seduce the leadership of the newly emergent trade unions by making concessions in 1979. But all of those concessions, including the recognition of the right of African workers to form trade unions, was to stimulate the appetite for more and to raise the confidence of the working class, leading to the emerging trade union movements quadrupling in size within 4 years. And by 1985, the new trade union federation, COSATU, was born, preceded by the formation of different federations, the most significant of which were two: the Federation of Unions of South Africa, of South African Trade Unions in 1982, and the Council of Unions of South Africa. And they raised the confidence and the power of the working class to the point where the ANC leadership, having initially observed the movement of the working class with indifference and outright hostility. In fact, when we arranged, for example, for meetings between the more left-wing leaders of the Labour Party, NEC, like Dennis Skinner, between them and the General Secretary at the time, the current President of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, and of the National Union of Mine Workers, and the President, the leadership of the ANC denounced those meetings. And initially their attitude towards the trade unions was that these were yellow unions, that the apartheid regime would never allow unions to operate in South Africa unless these unions were collaborators with the apartheid regime. That is the contempt and the grotesque underestimation of the power of the working class that dominated the outlook and the consciousness of the leadership of the ANC and SACP in exile. But inside the country, the power of the movement left the leadership, the government and imperialism with instilled in them a growing alarm, because it was not only the power of the working class, but also the consciousness of the working class. If one looks at the proceedings of the founding Congress of COSATU, for example, in 1985, which, by the way, proceeded despite the fact that the apartheid regime had declared the first state of emergency in May of 1985, since the 1960 state of emergency that had led to the banning of the ANC. The workers defied the state of emergency and went ahead, leaving the apartheid regime with no alternative but to allow the founding of COSATU to proceed. And out of the deliberations, the outlook of the workers was apparent. You had speaker after speaker, shop steward after shop steward, making the point that the struggle against apartheid and the struggle against capitalism are two sides of the same bloody coin. That it is not possible to dismantle apartheid without confronting the capitalist system itself. That was the predominant outlook, particularly of the guiding layers of the organized workers in South Africa. And this alarmed the capitalist class, who then recognized the necessity to begin to try and find ways other than outright repression, which clearly was having the opposite effect to that which they intended, to try and secure an agreement with credible leaders amongst black people that they could use as a fire hose to try and contain the movement. And that is how the secret talks between the leadership of the ANC in exile and Mandela himself started taking place. It is not an accident, by the way, that Mandela was removed from Robben Island to a prison on the mainland. Robben Island is an island off the shore of Cape Town, so that he would not be under the pressure of his fellow ANC leaders. Something, by the way, that enormously concerned the late Winnie Mandela, who thought that this was a plot to try and trap Mandela into a compromise agreement. And she made it clear that if such an agreement, if Mandela found it necessary to engage in such an agreement, she herself would take up arms and go back into the bush. It's one of the reasons that she suffered the kind of isolation, not only by the regime, by the way, and imperialism, but also by sections of the ANC leadership operating as their representatives inside the country. So the capitalist class was alarmed by these developments and started engaging Mandela, started engaging the exiled leadership, particularly Thabo Mbeki, in secret talks. So far as the ANC's own role internally is concerned, they began to recognize that putting themselves against COSATU risked alienating themselves from the spinal column of the mass movement that was challenging the apartheid regime. And they then changed tactics and engaged in an exercise of seducing the leadership politically and capturing what was an independent movement and placed them under the leadership of the ANC through the establishment of what came to be known as the Tripartite Alliance, led by the ANC, but in words, an alliance of equals, reducing COSATU into a labor desk of the ANC in reality, whose responsibility was to contain particularly the anti-capitalist aspirations of the working class itself. That is what COSATU's role was reduced to in that period. Nonetheless, if one looks at the slogan at the back of the 1987 Congress of COSATU, the slogan read, "Socialism means freedom." But inside the country, the supporters of the ANC embarked in a ferocious struggle against the class independence of the working class, and in particular the ideas that we as the Marxist Workers Tendency were putting forward. And all these developments created the basis, therefore, for the negotiated settlement that took place in 1994, the aim of which was to ensure that the struggle of the working class did not entail, in the course of toppling white minority rule, threaten the existence of capitalism itself. That was the purpose of the negotiating settlement. And they found, to their pleasant surprise, a leadership in the ANC and a Communist Party leadership that provided the theoretical justification for it through the infamous two-stage theory, according to which you must first fight for democracy now and for socialism sometime in the dim and distant future, at the point we are never told how to recognize how deep democracy had to be, how wide it had to be before we had to go over from the first to the second stage. But to their pleasant surprise, they found that that they had been the victims of their own propaganda, the apartheid regime, that the ANC was not communist, that on the contrary, it was anti-communist. And this, of course, was not clear to the masses, but it was very clear to us. When Mandela was interviewed in 1956 and asked whether the Freedom Charter, with its clauses calling for the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, whether that signified that the ANC had shifted to the left and that the Freedom Charter was a blueprint for socialism, Mandela's reply was unambiguous, crystal clear. And I want to read to the comrades what he had to say. He said, whilst the Charter proclaims democratic changes of a far-reaching nature, it is by no means a blueprint for a socialist state, but a program for the unification of various classes and groupings amongst people on a democratic basis. Under socialism, this is a man who had taken the trouble, by the way, to read a little bit of Marx. Under socialism, he says, the workers hold state power. They and the peasants own the means of production, the land, the factories, and the mills. All production is for use and not for profit. The Charter does not contemplate such profound economic and political changes. And I won't read everything. I'll just go on to the next part. He says that it is true that in demanding the nationalization of the banks, the gold mines, and the land, the Charter strikes a fatal blow at the financial and gold mining monopolies and farming interests that have for centuries plundered the country and condemned its people to servitude. But such a step is absolutely imperative and necessary, excuse me, because the realization of the Charter is inconceivable, in fact impossible, unless and until these monopolies are first smashed up and the national wealth of the country turned over to the people. And this is the critical part. The breaking up and democratization of these monopolies will open up fresh fields for the development of a prosperous non-European bourgeois class. For the first time in the history of this country, the non-European bourgeoisie will have the opportunity to own in their own name and right mines and factories and trade and private enterprise will boom and flourish as never before. Now, you couldn't be clearer than that about what the ANC leadership has historically stood for. And everything that the ANC has carried out since it entered government and won the elections in '94 is perfectly consistent with that vision, except, of course, that by the time that the ANC came to power in 1984, it was no longer possible for them to proceed with the program that Mandela had insisted remained fundamental upon his release in 1990 from prison. He declared the Freedom Charter and its nationalization clauses as fundamental, and that it would be inconceivable for the ANC not to conduct its political campaign for power on that basis. But by 1992, Mandela had been politically re-educated, I'm afraid. He was taken on an international tour to Bonn before the unification of Germany, the capital of West Germany at the time. He was taken to Paris, he was taken to London, he was taken to New York, and by the time he came back, he declared privatization to be the fundamental policy of the ANC. And the reason that this pressure was exerted on them is that whereas capitalism had been compelled in the period immediately following the Second World War to make concessions from the top to stop revolution from below, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries, like in Britain, where you saw the introduction of the National Health Service, the nationalization of the coal mines, the steel industry, and so on and so forth. By the time the ANC comes to power, neoliberalism was the order of the day. The capitalist class, in any event, had never adopted nationalization for any other purposes but to try and save their system and to make the necessary concessions to the working class in those particular circumstances. But by 1972, 1971, the world had entered into the first synchronized recession, and the policy of the capitalist class began to change and is now, as we know today, dominated by a neoliberalism where the idea of state intervention is anathema. That was the order of the day by the time the ANC was unbanned and engaged in negotiations and hastily abandoned nationalization, which in any event could only have been achieved through a mobilization of the working class against capitalism. But that would have meant that the ANC would go to the working class and say, please, let us enter into a popular front to tackle white monopoly capital, as they incorrectly refer to it. And then once capitalism had been defeated, ask the working class to bend their backs and to subordinate themselves to the exploitation of the new masters of the economic summits of the country, the black capitalist class. The ANC leadership had the good sense to understand that that would never fly with the working class, so they did not dare. And therefore, their job throughout the negotiations period was to contain the anger of the masses, to call mass action where necessary, even as the regime was stepping up the so-called black-on-black violence, using the Inkatha Freedom Party, which had been created by the ANC by its own admission in 1985 at a time when they expelled at a special congress our comrades for denouncing the secret talks that they were having with the leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party, Gacha Buthelezi. So in the period 1990 to 1994, the apartheid regime did everything in its power to try and weaken the ANC, divide the masses through so-called black-on-black violence, but at the same time use that to secure concessions from the ANC leadership. Eventually, of course, the elections took place. The ANC won an overwhelming victory. But even that, by the way, was manipulated to be lower than the actual vote that the ANC received in order to ensure that the ANC would not come under pressure to carry out a thoroughgoing transformation that could potentially threaten capitalism itself. So, comrades, to try and bring my remarks to a close, the struggle against apartheid was recognized by the working class to be a struggle that had to be fought simultaneously against the capitalist class. The leadership of the ANC's role was to try and prevent the social side of the struggle, the struggle against the capitalist class from succeeding, and to manipulate the trade unions, particularly COSATU, into supporting the pro-capitalist aims of the ANC leadership itself. That is why, when the elections took place, the ANC had abandoned the Freedom Charter. In its place, they conducted the election campaign in 1994 with a document known as the Reconstruction and Development Programme, which differed from the Freedom Charter in this critical respect, that it made no provision for nationalization. They had conducted a heart transplant, if you like, on the Freedom Charter. The result of this is that when the ANC entered government, they had relieved themselves of the pressure that such a program would have exerted on them and the expectations amongst the masses that it would have raised. But not only that, the ANC leadership went a lot further. They abandoned even the diluted Reconstruction and Development Program, and by 1996 adopted an openly neoliberal program, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy, which of course set into motion the class polarization within society, the impoverishment of the working class, and the beginning of the decline of the support of the ANC amongst the masses. That polarization culminated in the Marikana massacre, which, as Peter Taft predicted in his 1994 pamphlet, that the policies of the ANC would eventually lead the ANC government to train its guns on the working class, was confirmed, with 33 workers massacred for merely demanding a wage increase, taking themselves outside of the workplace, sitting on a hill and asking for negotiations. The climate for which massacre, by the way, was created by the current president, who denounced the strike as a criminal act that needs to be dealt with concomitantly.